Hello. So meiosis is quite complicated, and to go over all the mechanisms might confuse more people than it would help. And as I have seen the exam, I want to try and help in the simplest way possible. So we're going to skip over quite a lot of conceptual stuff, and I probably won't explain stuff the greatest. I'm going to write some practice problems, and I would pay special attention to those because I think that those will help the most. And I guess I want to say apologize for not doing well. Um, Only occurs in sexually producing organisms, and this requires these organisms to be diploid. And meiosis ultimately produces sex cells called gametes that are haploid. So we talked about this earlier. We go from one diploid cell to four haploid cells. Now, what is sex? Sex is where one gamete from one organism, which is haploid, combines with another gamete from another organism, also haploid, to form the offspring, which will be diploid. Now, why would it be diploid if it came from haploid stuff? Well, think about it. Haploid entails having one set of DNA, and diploid entails having two sets of DNA. If you combine one set of DNA with two sets of DNA, you would get two sets of DNA. So that would be a diploid genome. Now, it can differ from organism to organism, but the most common the notion of a gamete would be a small mobile one, which would be the sperm, and a large nutrient-rich gamete that's not very mobile, which would be the egg for males and females of Homo sapiens. Okay, so what are the advantages of sex? And before we talk about that, it might be explained in the model. And this is a very watered down model. But we see that we start out with a diploid mother cell. And we know that it is diploid because it's got these homologous chromosomes. And looking down here, we have four haploid gametes. We know they're haploid because we don't see the presence of any homologous chromosomes. So we see from over here to over here that we now have sister chromosomes. That means that DNA replication was required. So each chromosome was replicated. And going from here to here, we see that our sister chromosomes are still present. So what we separated, what we split in half, was the homologous chromosomes. So we separated homologous chromosomes. Cool beans. Okay, and then we see that each of these two cells now split as well. And the sister chromosomes are no longer present. So what happened in this step was we separation of sister chromosomes, and that left each one with a single chromosome of each kind, meaning like you can't have a homologous set in the haploid one because then it wouldn't be haploid. Now that we might understand the general mechanisms of meiosis, why is sex so commonplace in the animal kingdom? And that is because it ultimately offers a lot more genetic diversity. So looking over here, we see that our resulting gametes, that they have quite a lot of variety in them. And if you think about this, over here there are only two sets of homologous chromosomes represented. For humans, we have 23 of them. So that's happening for 23 of them, and they're all being segregated in such a manner. So our gametes have an insane amount of genetic diversity among them. And if you consider that happening twice, both for the mother and the father, that gives a very high chance of, you're just always swapping up the genome for the offspring. So there's a lot of genetic diversity, especially when we compare it to something that is asexually producing. So if something is asexually producing, what would happen is that the population would just stay stagnant. It would have the same genome, it would have the same alleles, blah, 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 blah. Uh, let's say that we assume no mutation, where mutation would kind of be the only way to actually produce a novel allele. But what is the advantage of having that greater genetic diversity within a population? So this is evolution, and oh my goodness, we still have to cover evolution, haha. Uh, so but whatever. So okay, let's say that we have a population of animals. Wow, and they live in a cold environment, but because of global warming, it's getting hotter. Well, they've lived in that environment for so long, and they have alleles that are well suited for the cold. And but let's say this is an asexually producing population. That means that they all have the same uniform genome. That means that when it gets hot, if one of them doesn't have the suitable alleles to survive in the hot environment, none of them do, and then the population will die out. But if you had a species that was producing by a sex, you would have more genetic diversity possible. So let's say it was getting hot. Well, the ones that aren't resistant to the cold, they don't have the alleles that are good for the heat, they die off. But you might have some organisms that do have the alleles that are heat resistant, and then those can survive. So that's the advantage of sex. It introduces a lot of genetic diversity to a given population. And then there were two terms in meiosis that we should know about. Let me make sure to share my screen. Okay, cool. So my screen is shared, and I stole this from Khan Academy. The law of segregation states that two alleles of a single trait will separate randomly, meaning that there is a 50% chance that either allele will end up in the gamete. So you got to learn. Try, like, I would look up an article and read about it, because I think that's the best way to learn. But the law of segregation basically entails the process of meiosis. Okay, so looking at this, we see that an allele had an equal chance of ending up. Oh, okay, but these are not alleles. So let me explain. Each of these are a chromosome, but they carry alleles on them. Now, we're going to talk about crossing over and recombination, which is pretty confusing. But for now, looking at this diagram, this chromosome has an allele associated with it, and the blue one has an allele associated with it. That means that in each one of these, because 50% of them have the cyan, 50% of the produced gametes have the cyan chromosome, that means that 50% of them also have the alleles that the cyan one carries. So the law of segregation says that two alleles of a single trait will separate randomly. And okay, so let's break that apart. Separate randomly. So that means that you cannot have two alleles in one gamete. Like, you cannot have a homologous chromosome. Like you see how they're all separate from one another? They were segregated. Like, this homologous chromosome was not put in here. This one wasn't put in here. Yeah, if it was, then it wouldn't be haploid. So that's what it means by separate. And by randomly, it's more fair, because by randomly, it means like they have the same chance of entering the gamete. So they, like, this had a 50% chance, this one had a 50% chance of being in the gamete. So 50% of the gametes will have the allele. Is fair. Squandered. Squandered. I was just trying to say that I did not explain it well, because I did not. And then next we have the law of independent assortment, which says that one allele of one gene separates independently of an allele of another gene. So what this is trying to say is, or what is this saying here, is that the alleles, they segregate, and they are not, they do not, they are not impacted by each other when they are entering chromosomes. For example, there isn't, okay, like in theory, an allele is not connected with another allele. So if the law of independent assortment did not exist, that would mean that when we get one allele, we have a higher chance of getting an allele that's usually associated with it. So that would ultimately mean that we would result in more gametes that have that particular favorable combination. But there is no favorable combination. That one allele goes one place, one allele goes another place. They are sorted independently of one another. The fate of one allele does not affect the fate of another allele. And what is the implication of this? And okay, wink, wink. This is the only important thing I wanted you to take from the independent and the segregation stuff. Independent assortment leads to more gamete possibilities. For nothing else, just remember the sentence. Independent assortment leads to more gamete possibilities. But let me just explain this so it's not too much of a cop-out. So independent assortment. If there was not independent assortment, that would mean that certain allele combinations would be more favorable and more common. And because it's less random, that means you ultimately have less gamete possibilities. All right, one more thing to cover. So in meiosis, there is an important step called prophase 1. It is prophase 1. And what is important about it is that the homologous chromosomes will line up with each other and then they'll swap DNA. Okay, let's say that this is, wow. Let's say that this is one set of sister chromosomes and that during prophase 1, it interacts with this one. Okay, so what happens is that as these two homologous chromosomes are touching, so remember what a homologous chromosome is. There are different chromosomes in that they have different alleles, but they are the same type of chromosome. And what happens is that they'll swap genes. So what'll happen is that after they interact, they'll kind of mesh with each other, and you'll end up with something like this. Okay, so what just happened was that our homologous chromosomes just traded genes, and this means that when our gametes are formed, our gametes have a lot more genetic diversity because a given chromosome could have had that crossover. So it's basically an entirely new chromosome. So if you think about it, our set of DNA are 46 chromosomes. 23 of them are paternal, 20 of them are maternal. Well, by the process of meiosis, you don't really inherit like a fully intact and a fully original paternal or maternal thing. They're modified a little bit. And we will see this in the problems coming up.